carbon stays in the atmosphere for up to 500,000 years, which is just incredible to think about it. And incredible the kind of responsibility that we create, but how do we connect this kind of very long-term thinking about what the impacts are to the decisions that we make today? Good afternoon, welcome to Oxford Tea Talks. My name is Juliane Reinecke. I'm a professor of management studies and faculty director of sustainability at Oxford Saïd Business School.
Hi, and I'm Mary Johnstone-Louis. I am a senior fellow in management practice here at Oxford Saïd Business School, and really looking forward to this conversation with my colleague Juliane. And we are going to be discussing the wide world of sustainability, ESG, something that's very close to our hearts, and our research and the work that we do here at the business school. And so really just a chance for us to have a conversation around where is this space going now in 2025, looking at, we've been seeing what are being called ESG backlash activities in some policy areas. We've been seeing some questions around the role of sustainability, the role of climate in corporate action. I would love to just have a conversation with you around what's your sense from a teaching, from a research perspective, where are things at the moment now?
Yeah, I feel we hear a lot of debates about whether ESG is dead, is it still alive? And I think it's a bit of a misnomer to say it's dead, because if we think about the issues, E, S, and G, starting with governance. I mean, everybody needs governance. Every company needs governance. And environmental sustainability for the E. Climate change is happening, so it's not going to go away. It's not going to go away by closing your eyes and ignoring that it doesn't happen. So I feel it's just a bit ignoring the issues. And social sustainability, of course, with COVID, we have seen how fragile corporate supply chains is, how health, physical and mental health, matters so much for a company's workforce. And so I think the issues are still more relevant than ever. The question is maybe how do we frame these issues? How do we talk about them? Because I think ESG is very much a financial risk perspective, and which kind of frames these things in kind of a very negative light, in a very risk-related light. And I think maybe we have to think a bit, how do we reframe these issues from kind of a perspective that resonates more both with kind of businesses, but also the wider public? I don't know, what do you think, Mary?
I think it's so true. And I think what we know for sure as those who are spending our time in business schools, we spend a lot of time with those who have had experience in policy or with policymakers. And we know that policy moves in cycles, right? So we're not surprised when certain issues fall into favor or out of favor at the policy level. What we know is that businesses are fundamentally dependent on the environmental and social systems around them in order to create value. And I think that's the big mindset shift that I think sometimes in the excitement around some aspects of ESG that ran up to this year, sometimes there was that misstep, if you will, that we really need to think about, how does this tie in to business value creation? How does it tie into the way businesses think about risk? How does it tie into the way that they think about their future of their industry and the opportunities that they have available to them? And I think none of that has shifted. And so in that sense, I think I see it as a really exciting opportunity to reframe and to bring it actually back to where it has always been. I think for our students, certainly, and for the executives that we teach and the sort of leading companies that we engage with, who are constantly thinking about whether it's environmental scenarios, looking at resource scenarios, looking at workforce, looking at cost of commodities. These are fundamental to the ways that businesses create value over time. And so I think it's a really nice opportunity for us as instructors, us as researchers, to think about how are we creating and enabling companies and enabling leaders to build companies that are really fit for purpose, given that they fundamentally cannot extract themselves from the complexity and the challenges that we're facing socially, politically, and environmentally at the time. And I was actually asked, this was a couple of years ago now, I was asked to write an introduction to a Harvard Business Review Insights Guide to ESG. And at the time, I was a little reticent because I never fully sat with this idea of ESG as being the only lens and even necessarily the most helpful strategic lens, not because it's not valuable for some audiences, but it's fundamentally valuable for capital markets investors. It's a metric that helps you to understand, ideally, if it's done well, compare, which is not always possible, but it's meant to be an external metric. And that doesn't help you get where you need to go when you're really thinking about that opportunity that comes from sustainability, which I think is where the most of our work comes. And that's where the real excitement lies.
Yeah, and I also think that what you mentioned there is the systems, right? You mentioned systems, environmental systems, nature, society as a system. And often when we talk about ESG or sustainability reporting, I think what it does is that it takes these like big systemic questions and tries to apply them to the level of individual business. And of course, it's still super useful for investors and also for business leaders to understand how do these systemic risks affect my business. But then when it comes to the questions, okay, what do we do about them? How do we govern them? I think that's where then often the disconnect emerges between, okay, here are these kind of big system level issues. And on the other hand, what do individual companies do about them? And I think that can be quite frustrating to think about if it's only seen in this kind of risk perspective, because as an individual company, you can't really do much to shift the systemic risk if you try to do it on your own and if you only have it from a risk perspective. And I think that's kind of where some of these kind of disconnects are coming in. And I think, I don't know if that's what you mean by the mindset shift, but I think it's quite a challenging mindset shift, right? Because it's really about thinking not just about the supply chain, but also the systems that supply chains and businesses really depend on.
Yes, which you've written loads about. And I'd love to, I couldn't agree with you more. I think the fundamental mindset shift is, I say to all the students that I teach, sustainability is the biggest innovation opportunity and the biggest innovation challenge of our time. Fundamentally, we need to rethink at scale how we will feed, clothe, house, transport, care for the billions of people on this planet in a way that makes, I would say, much smarter and much more efficient and much more resilient use of the resources that we have on the planet, right? So both natural and looking at the carbon systems, but also thinking about how do we create this in a way that creates stable and resilient societies, right? Which is something you've written so much about, specifically looking at the textile sector, the fashion industry, looking at the challenges that companies have faced as they, at the individual firm level, try to address these big intractable problems at the supply chain level. And I think some of that work is really important more broadly for sustainability, because what your work really points companies to is that they need to collaborate. I wondered if you wanted to share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the work that you alluded to on the ready-made garment industry, specifically from Southeast Asia, Bangladesh. And if one company really tries to create a sustainable supply chain, that's incredibly hard. But if you have, in the case of the Bangladesh, for instance, the Bangladesh Accord if you have 200 companies that all pull on the same string and they all say, we have the same goal, we pool our resources and we do it together. And all of a sudden, it's not so hard anymore, because every individual company's contribution is relatively small to the amount of the change that can actually be done. And there we have seen that within a very short amount of time, if you think about transforming an entire industry, within about 5 years, we have seen an industry transform from being inherently unsafe to being, one of the safest garment manufacturing countries in the world. And I'm not saying there's still a lot of other problems, to be addressed, but just on this one metric, we've seen this transformation by companies actually working together rather than everybody trying it on their own. But yeah.
And I think the key is it's because it was a shared challenge for all of them,
Yeah.
right? And so the key is that with any systems level issue, it is something that affects cross industry, cross sector. So it's actually incredibly inefficient for individual companies to try and address it alone, right? Because it is a shared pain, if you will. And I was thinking about one company I've gotten to know more recently, which our sort of Dutch and Western European audience will know, Tony's Chocolonely, who have this same kind of thinking, this idea that actually we all love chocolate, we love cocoa, we love that it's in our diet, right? I wrote a little piece in Forbes about this for Valentine's Day. It's something that we look forward to for celebrations. And unfortunately, it has a terrible dark side, which you know well. And the idea that actually slave labor, child labor, forced labor is endemic to the cocoa supply chain. And so what Tony's has done is they've taken a really interesting innovation lens and said, we will compete on chocolate, but we will collaborate on cocoa, because cocoa is what all individuals and all actors and all investors and all retailers who use cocoa in their products are exposed to this really significant risk, which is fundamentally baked into the way that the sourcing is done. And so they now have created something called Tony's Open Chain, which now has over 20 partners all across Western Europe, including large grocery stores, including retailers who would be seen as their competitors. And they're all saying, rather than us trying to address this on our own, which simply won't happen and is not effective from a resource perspective, let's go together. And I think that's what makes me really excited when I think about, back to the beginning of our conversation, you know, are these issues still relevant for companies? Are companies still thinking about sustainability? 100%, because it's utterly essential to their viability long term.
And I think cocoa is such a good example when we talk about sustainability and whether it's relevant, because if you're a chocolate manufacturer, the future success of your business is so dependent on your cocoa growers. And we know that cocoa growers, they face climate risk. They also face an aging population. Cocoa growing is not a profitable business for most smallholder farmers that grow cocoa. And so if you really think long term about the success of your business, then actually addressing these issues just makes good business sense, because otherwise there won't be chocolate businesses in the future. And so I think that's a really great idea. And I think it also shows how there can be collaboration on these kind of, you mentioned sustainability innovations, and sharing these ideas rather than trying to compete on the supply chain. And I think that's where I, in my research, have seen quite a big shift in the recent years, where, for instance, sourcing was seen as, this is kind of a competitive issue. We can't possibly share our supplier lists and so on, to a much different approach, not in all industries, but in, like we talk about cocoa, we talk about in fashion, for instance, where companies have realized, no, actually, we should collaborate. It's often they talk about pre-competitive collaboration, where it makes a lot more sense to tackle some of these issues together and then compete on the high street. And that's, I think, a much better approach to address some of these systemic issues.
Absolutely. So I think when we talk about sustainability, we often talk about it, you and I, in terms of systems. And fundamentally, it's about understanding what are the social and environmental systems on which your company depends and on which it impacts, and then building your strategy from there, rather than taking a kind of compliance-based, reporting-based approach, which is actually almost outside in. It's really about having that leadership to step forward and say, this is about an inside-out approach. And I think it does make me think of the work that we've talked about, particularly the work you've done on temporality, and why this is challenging for companies. So why is that an important topic for you? And what is it about temporality and long-term? What's so important there that you're spending so much time on it?
Yeah, so this is an insight that came really early on. So I've been studying sustainability now for 20 years or so, for a really long time. And early on, I noticed that many of the issues, the challenges in that space of sustainability is because fundamentally there's a temporal mismatch, or there's a mismatch between the time horizon of corporate strategy, of corporate decision making, which is typically 3 to 5 years, is seen as kind of long term in many industries, and many of the sustainability issues that really demand a very, very long term approach. I mean, I'm working right now with an environmental engineer on carbon accounting, and I'm learning about the carbon cycle from much more scientific point of view, that carbon stays in the atmosphere for up to 500,000 years, which is just incredible to think about it, and incredible the kind of responsibility that we create. But how do we connect this kind of very long-term thinking about what the impacts are to the decisions that we make today. And so sustainability makes absolute sense in the long term, but sometimes there's this disconnect between the decisions we make now, how is this going to affect really the long term. And I think that's also maybe part of the mindset shift that you mentioned. If we could say systems, thinking about how through collaboration we can address systems, but then also how can we really think about, you know, how actions in the present affect the future, but also how we now have to, you know, think about these futures and imagine what is a future that, you know, we want the next generation to inherit, and what type of decisions, what type of business models, what type of innovations do we need today to enable that future. And that is, I think that's a quite challenging proposition, but I also think it can be quite exciting. That's maybe the other shift that I think we need for to rethink sustainability and how we talk about it, that we often see it as a risk. We think about it as something negative. Like, you know, we talk about net zero. It's something, okay, it's zero. How about we think about this as a positive development? And I think you work on regenerative businesses, right?
That's true.
And I think that has a much more positive connotation already. So I was wondering if you could share a bit.
It's so true.
You're thinking around
it's so
that.
True. I mean, I think that our listeners will know the language around sustainability has changed over time. We used to think about corporate social responsibility or corporate citizenship. We've had the language around triple bottom line. So this language, I think, can be a little bit inaccessible, but I think it's actually quite simple. And I think that the regeneration language, to me, is actually useful. It doesn't just feel like another trend. It feels like it's a mindset shift, moving from thinking about how do we manage harm to how do we create positive benefit, right? So when we think about regeneration, when we think about what does it mean to change something for good, it's really this idea that actually you're going beyond the status quo. So regeneration came out of really regenerative agriculture. So the idea of restoring agricultural lands and helping the soil to reach the kind of health that it would have if it hadn't been exposed to industrial farming, which can be quite extractive. I think there's a broader way to think about regeneration, which is to really think about from the perspective of finance, from the perspective of finance and investment, of governance, of the way that you manage your employees, your decision systems. How are those reinforcing the status quo, right? How are those actually continuing the kind of what we are used to in terms of the systems and the impact of firms on systems and vice versa? And how are they going beyond, right? And I think things like the Bangladesh Accords, things like the Tony's Open Chain, these are examples of companies coming together and saying, we are not content. And actually the risk here in this current system is too high. And it's a challenge for us, it's a problem for us, it's not good for our business, and it's not good for society. And I think regeneration really takes that mindset to another level. So much more we could talk about. We actually got some questions in advance of this. So I'm gonna grab the first one and I will just share it with you. It really aligns with what we've just been talking about. So is net zero a destination or a distraction from deeper transformation? It's a great question.
That's a great question. So net zero, the way we talk about it is, first of all, refers to how companies act upon the Paris Agreement to reduce warming to 1.5 ideally, or 2 degrees. And for that, we need to reach net zero carbon emissions. And typically companies, so about, I think, 2/3 of the largest companies have committed to net zero, typically by 2040, 2045. Now, is that a journey or a distraction? So on the one hand, I think it really creates a conversation. It creates a point in the future so that companies now have to think about their long-term commitments, and then have to think backwards. Okay, what needs to be in place for this to become a reality? There's also a bit of a danger by saying, oh, this is kind of my successor who have to deal with that, and maybe by 2050 we'll have reached that. So I think it's a bit. It depends a bit on how it's interpreted. I think it's useful because it puts it on the agenda, and it will require deeper transformation if it is made real. So in that sense, I don't think it's a contradiction. It's not an either or, but to really, if it's taken seriously, it will require deeper transformation of the whole business model.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and ideally, it's not a business model to net zero, but to something like net positive or regeneration. Right? Yeah,
right? Exactly.
Yeah. Shall I see what next?
Oh, sure. We have more questions.
We have.
Sounds great. Please do.
All right. What are companies doing to make sustainability everyone's job and not just the sustainability teams?
Oh, such a great question. I think it is, again, that mindset shift, right? If it's something that fundamentally is done for compliance, for reporting, for an external audience, then it's a huge missed opportunity. So the companies that I see who are really taking advantage of sustainability as something that spurs innovation are indeed, of course, equipping and resourcing their sustainability teams who have the expertise and who have that knowledge, but they are tying it to core business strategies. So what does that mean? That means that, first of all, the executive teams, the board, should be able to identify the 2 or 3 key social and environmental systems on which that company depends and on which it impacts. And if the boards and the executive team are not to that point, that's where to start. So sometimes it's as simple as asking that question. Second, I think it's then about thinking, what kind of data and information do we have about these systems? How well do we understand them? Full stop. How well do we also then understand our impact and our dependency on them, right? So it's that question of, what do we know? Where do we need more data? What kind of data could we actually begin to gather to begin to fully build a picture of what the impacts and dependencies are here? And then I think the next thing is, who uses that information, right? Is it used in decision useful criteria, right? Is it used for capital allocation? Is it something that's coming up in board agendas? Is it something that is used to help think about how are we measuring performance in this company, right? And so it's that question around, what's the level of knowledge? What do we know? Where are our gaps? And then who's using this information? And I think, building to your point and to the point that we talk about around long-termism, the final key is, do we have structures? Do we have mechanisms? Do we have governance in place to ensure that we continue to educate ourselves, continue to become informed, and continue to use this information over time, right? Because I think one thing we often see is, it can be the case that a company's attitude or approach in this area is very tied to a specific leader, right? And that can be incredible, but it can also be a risk. And so I think the real key is to think about, what's the knowledge level? How is it tied to strategy? What information do you have? Where do you need more? And then what are the structures, whether that's through performance incentive plans or through governance or through the way that you think about recruitment, for example, right? Are you bringing this into your recruitment? Are you bringing this into the kind of mindset that you're bringing into the company? I think those kind of 4 key areas are how you take it to from something that is possibly externally focused and possibly sitting with one team who are probably doing all that they can and really bringing it to the heart of the company. And that is the transformation that will actually bring value. That is where the value is generated. So there we go. I think we have another question, which I think, let's see, what role should academic institutions like Oxford play in accelerating or challenging the sustainability status quo? Very relevant.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I do think that's a question for both of us, actually,
for both of
right?
us, yes.
Yeah. I mean, broadly speaking, we have a huge role to play through education, through kind of climate education, creating climate literacy amongst our students, right? And so I feel it's very hard in a business situation to really talk about these issues with confidence. if you don't really know the underlying science. It only has to be basic because it's very complicated, but at least to know the basics. And I think that will give kind of our students then, when they go out and become corporate leaders, to have much more confidence about this. So I mean, I think that's like one of the key roles that we have, right?
It's so true.
And then of course, I mean, you and I, we engaged in quite a number of these, I would call them more convening, convening businesses.
Yeah.
Where I feel we can really create this sort of a safe space in a sense. I don't know how safe it is because we're also sometimes quite critical, right? So
I think it's constructive challenge.
Constructive challenge,
you come
exactly.
To university to share ideas and to debate and to be challenged. I think we create that space. I think that's what we aim to do.
Yeah, exactly. And where we can bring people together, businesses, but also civil society, students, policymakers from different angles, and just curate a conversation that is informed, that is critical, that is constructive, and that kind of really drives the conversation forward. I find those incredibly inspiring. I don't know if you want to mention any one of those in particular. I'm talking about the Regeneration Lab that you're leading, or any other example.
I think there's so much to share. So what do universities do, right? Fundamentally, universities create new knowledge. They gather students for teaching, and they also have a kind of convening, curation, conversation, agenda setting kind of role. And I think that actually to do this well, we need to do all three. And I think it's been incredible to see what's happening with the Climate Bootcamp, with the MBAs. I'm really proud of the work that we do on executive teaching, looking at how leaders can actually come for a short time and bring these ideas into their organizations. And then I think the more kind of relational and really long-term work is thinking about these convenings, like you're saying. So just this year, a really, really exciting set of companies gathered here in Oxford who all under the banner of Regeneration are thinking about how do they go beyond the status quo in their industries. So this was something that we did in partnership with an amazing Brazilian company called Natura, who have a long history of real innovation in terms of thinking about how they're sourcing from the Amazon, thinking about their governance. And it was really a privilege to bring these companies together. I think one of the most important things is that no company has all these answers now, right? And I think that's also a role that we play, is normalizing that and saying, actually, this is an institution of learning, right? And there's not a single company in the world at the moment who can say, we have got this figured out, right? All companies are facing social and environmental risks that go to the core of their strategy and that fundamentally are shifting, are complex, and require constant review, right? And require a real innovation mindset. And I think creating that space and making that a normal part of what leadership looks like is one of the most powerful things we can do here in Oxford. And doing it, I'll just add, across the university. So we've both been very involved with our wonderful colleagues at the Smith School for Environment and Enterprise, who are a group of individuals and researchers and teams who are thinking carefully about the role of enterprise, particularly on the environmental transition and on nature. Similarly with our colleagues at Oxford Net Zero. So I think looking across the university and bringing those ideas to the school, using the business school as a way to create conversations across departments, just as we kind of teach, right? We have to practice what we preach. None of the companies we work with will solve sustainability on their own, and we need to do the same. We need to be reaching across the university and bringing those ideas together. So thanks so much. This has been such a great chance to have this tea talk, to have this conversation. And yes, any final words? Do you want to kind of wrap us up at all? Or really, really great to have this time together.
Yeah, I mean, I just really enjoyed having this conversation with you. These are some of the themes we talk about quite a lot, actually, right? But we never come together in such a setting and get the opportunity to explore them at this level of depth. So that was actually a lot of fun. So thank you
so much. And thanks for joining for Tea Talks, and join you for the next one. Thanks so much.